at the infundibulum. So find the infundibulum right behind the optic chiasma.
Cut below it?
And yeah, right below the optic chiasma through the infundibulum, and just cut it. And you should end up with two halves that look something like this. And then take that, and you can pass it to the group nearest to you that's got it, that's the 2 group, so that they will have one to look at. Doesn't matter which one you give them, they'll do the same for identifying the parts.
Which one I want to give away? There you go.
So once you've got that, you just pass it off so that everybody's got at least one of these frontal sections to look at. Again, as mentioned in lecture, note, you've got this whitish material. What's the white stuff correspond to? I heard somebody say it. The myelin, right? Remember, that's the fatty stuff that wraps around the neurons. So when you see these white lines, that's areas that are specialized to send information quickly over long. One of those connections goes across from left to right sides. And we'll see that connection in a second when we cut the brain in a different way. But the only things we're looking at to identify in this particular view are the 3 of the ventricles. So the ventricles in the brain are spaces where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. And there are 4 of them, 3 of which we can see in this view. There's 2 lateral ventricles, and then there's a 3rd and a 4th. You can't see the 4th ventricle from this view. We'll see that in a different cut in a second. But your lateral ventricles are going to be the 2 upper sort of wings that you see, closer to the cerebral cortex. The 3rd ventricle is going to be the more medial and deeper one that goes all the way down to the infundibulum. The 3rd ventricle actually connects to the infundibulum. So if you cut it just right, you might actually be able to see that. In mine, I can't, even though I thought I was cutting it right. But you can see some of that line of the 3rd ventricle running down through the middle part of the brain right here. And then the last thing to identify on either side of the 3rd ventricle, near to where the infundibulum would attach, you have the hypothalamus, which is involved in a lot of the functioning of your brain. Again, it has many, many different functions. Just pick one of them for the day of the practical. But as an example, it controls, it sets your thermostat. Your internal body temperature is set by your hypothalamus. But it does a lot of other things too.
Which side is the hypothalamus?
It's on either side of the 3rd ventricle.
No, I mean like the side with the
It's going to be on the bottom, the ventral side.
So
the dorsal side, you've got your sulci and gyri. The ventral side is where the infundibulum and the optic chiasma are located. It's going to be the area of the brain right near that.
okay, so here.
Ventral side down here, spinal cord, cerebellum. You can orient yourself relatively easily. So your cerebral cortex is going to be the outer covering that you see up here. And as we said, the cerebral cortex is largely separated, but you have to communicate between the left and the right halves, and you do that through a structure called the corpus callosum. And that is basically going to look like this upside down Nike swoosh that you see right here. That's the corpus callosum, or colossum. That allows information to travel from the left to the right hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Is all this stuff. Not the membrane, but the opening directly below the corpus callosum would be the lateral ventricle. There are 2 of these, one on either side, so depending on which brain half you got, you'll still have a lateral ventricle to identify. And if you look carefully inside the lateral ventricle, you should find some delicate, let me see if I can zoom in on it a little better. So if I push open my ventricle, there's this brownish, gray, blackish stuff. This would be the choroid plexus. This would be the special set of cells that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. You'll find that in both ventricles. You'll also find it in the 3rd ventricle underneath. This typically will be more visible on brains where you have the dark lines on the sulci, because you've got the dye in there to show them off. If your sulci are not dark, your choroid plexus will typically be not very dark either. So you want to look on a brain that has some of the dark fluid in there to identify those.
Dr. Burnett, where's the third one?
Up here, you've got your third ventricle up here, and again, it would curve down to connect to the infundibulum, but you'd have to cut it just right to see that. So the second gap right here would be your third ventricle. The third ventricle, there's a connection that runs along here over your corpora quadrigemina, called the cerebral aqueduct, which would be this space, and then the fourth ventricle is going to be the area directly underneath the cerebellum, between the cerebellum and the spinal cord. And so if I sort of lift up the cerebellum, you can see the gap that corresponds to the fourth ventricle. So third ventricle's up here, fourth ventricle's down here. The connection between them would be the cerebral aqueduct. And aqueduct is just a pathway for water, but in the case of your brain, it allows cerebral spinal fluid. So all your ventricles are connected. So cerebral spinal fluid can flow from a lateral ventricle to the third to the fourth, and then out around the spinal cord as well. So all of the parts of the central nervous system have this fluid flow that allows nutrients and waste products to travel around to the appropriate locations. Item number 8, the hypothalamus, is going to be down on the area, again, if you follow your third ventricle down, maybe the area right around that on the ventral side of the brain, right near the optic chiasma. So this is going to be my hypothalamus. The pineal body, again, we saw that when we looked at the brain intact. There's your pineal body. There's your corpora quadrigemina with your superior and inferior colliculus. Superior above, inferior below. Cerebellum is the mass that we saw sitting on the spinal cord. And the difference here is that when it's cut open, you see this network of white lines inside of it called the arbor vitae. The arbor vitae means the tree of life. And this is named from the fact that injuries to the back of the head would damage the cerebellum, and they saw this distinctive structure and said, oh, well, it must be the cerebellum that controls heart rate and respiration, because when you get hit there, you tend to die. And so they assumed the cerebellum controlled that. We know that's not true now. Those things are controlled by the medulla and the pons. So an injury to the back of the head that hit the cerebellum was also damaging the pons and the medulla, and that was what was causing the heart and the lungs to stop. So calling this the tree of life is not really appropriate. This is, like I said, the cerebellum's involved in a lot of muscle control, stabilizing your movements and giving you fine motor control. So these networks are very important for movement, but they're not necessary for life. The cerebellum is damaged, like I said, you get ataxia, but it's not good, but it's not going to be life-threatening typically just because of cerebellum damage. It would have to be damage to the pons. So the pons you typically see as a bulge. So if you look at the ventral side, below the cerebellum, you should have this relatively smaller bulge. That would be the pons. The medulla would be the larger bulge. That's most of what goes underneath the cerebellum out to the spinal cord. And then infundibulum's on the list, but you really have to cut it just right to see that. The infundibulum would be if you could follow your third ventricle all the way down, which you can't on this brain. So the odds are pretty good you won't see the infundibulum from this view. So on the practical, that's not what we're going to use, because you have to cut it just right to see that. But the pons, again, the bulge that's in front, the medulla, the larger bulge that's behind that, and underneath the cerebellum, and the spinal cord sticking on.